In the scorched coral ridgeline of Peleliu, a Kentucky farm boy sergeant was about to witness his worst nightmare. A routine military advance turned deadly when Japanese machine gunners opened fire from an elevated position. Thomas "Red" Callister wasn't your typical Marine sergeant. For 3 brutal Pacific campaigns, he was a battle-hardened squad leader, known for keeping his men alive through Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. When Japanese bullets cut down his best friend Joe Ramirez before his eyes, they had no idea they were igniting a fury that would change the battle. Callister launched a suicidal charge up the ridge that would trigger a decisive counterattack against the enemy strongpoint. What began as a desperate act of grief would become a turning point. In the battle for Peleliu, the Marine battle line would never be the same after Red's one-man assault broke through where an entire company had failed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun beat down mercilessly on Peleliu's coral ridgeline, the heat rising in visible waves from the scorched earth. Sergeant Tom "Red" Callister's skin burned beneath his dirt-caked uniform, sweat cutting clean trails through the grime on his face. The acrid smell of cordite hung in the air, mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the putrid stench of death. His squad had been pinned down for nearly 3 hours now, the Japanese machine gun nest above them unleashing hell every time anyone so much as twitched. "Red, we gotta move soon," Corporal Joe Ramirez whispered, his normally easy smile replaced by grim determination. Pressed against the same jagged outcropping of coral as Red, Joe's dark eyes darted between his friend and the ridgeline above. "We stay here much longer. They'll bring in mortars." Red nodded, stealing a glance at the rest of his squad scattered among the sparse cover, craters and coral formations offering minimal protection against the relentless fire. Private First Class Eddie "Bookworm" Morris huddled behind a boulder, 20 yards to their left, clutching his radio like a lifeline. The kid's glasses were cracked, his scholarly face streaked with dirt and fear. Beyond him, Corporal Frank "Dixie" Watson had wedged himself and his machine gun into a shallow depression, his southern drawl audible even through the chaos as he cursed the Japanese gunners with creative profanity. "Lieutenant's still trying to get artillery support," Red replied, his Kentucky accent thickening as it always did under stress. "Says we hold position." Joe spat into the dirt. "We hold position. We die here." Red knew he was right. "Lieutenant." Raymond Foster was a good officer, smart, capable, but young. Too young, maybe, for the meat grinder that was Peleliu. Even now, Red could see him 50 yards back, shouting into a field phone, desperation evident in his rigid posture. "Give me covering fire," Joe said suddenly, his voice dropping to that dangerous calm Red had come to recognize over 3 campaigns together. "I can make it around that left flank. There's a blind spot." Red grabbed his arm. "Like hell you will." "There's no blind spot, Joe. That's suicide." "What suicide is sitting here waiting to die?" Joe's eyes locked onto Red's, and in them was the same determination that had carried them through Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. "I can make it. Trust me." Before Red could respond, machine gun fire raked across their position, sending fragments of coral flying. When it stopped, Joe flashed that cocky grin that had charmed every nurse from Melbourne to Pavuvu. "Just like that bar fight in San Diego, right? You remember?" Red did remember. 4 sailors against the 2 of them, and Joe had winked at him, before diving headfirst into the fray. They'd barely escaped with their lives, but Joe had laughed the whole way back to base, sporting a split lip and 2 black eyes. "This ain't a bar fight," Red growled. "Nah," Joe's smile softened. "This time we got guns." He pulled the St. Christopher medal from beneath his shirt, kissed it once, and then tucked it away. "When we get home, first round's on you. That Kentucky bourbon you're always bragging about." A feeling like ice water flooded Red's veins. "Joe? Hey, Dixie!" Joe called out. "Give me some covering fire on my mark." Dixie's head snapped up, his weathered face registering immediate understanding and disapproval. "Don't you do it, you crazy Mexican. That's a death sentence. Just shut up and shoot when I tell you." Joe snapped back, checking his rifle and loosening the grenades on his belt. "Lieutenant says hold position." Eddie called out, his voice cracking. Joe ignored him, coiling like a spring. Red, you take care of the boys if this goes sideways and tell my mama I didn't suffer, all right? Joe, wait. Now! Joe exploded from cover as Dixie, cursing loudly, opened fire on the ridge. Red joined in, his M1 kicking against his shoulder, as he desperately tried to suppress the machine gun nest. For one heart-stopping moment, it seemed to work. Joe zigzagged across the exposed ground, moving with the fluid grace of an athlete. Then the machine gun found him. The first burst kicked up dirt at his feet. The second caught him mid-stride, spinning him around like a grotesque puppet with its strings cut. Joe stumbled, somehow still upright, bullets tearing through his torso. No! Red's scream tore from his throat as he scrambled to his feet, only to be yanked back down by Eddie. You can't! They'll kill you too! The radio man shouted, his scholarly face contorted with horror. Red fought against him, watching helplessly as Joe collapsed to his knees. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and even at this distance, Red could see the confusion on his friend's face, the look of a man who couldn't understand why his body wasn't responding anymore. Joe raised a hand, reaching toward Red before pitching forward into the dirt. Joe! Red surged forward again, but now Dixie was there too, his powerful arms locking around Red's chest. He's gone, Red. Dixie's voice was uncharacteristically gentle beneath its harsh southern edge. Ain't nothing to be done now. Let me go, Red snarled, struggling. He might still be alive. He ain't. Dixie's grip tightened. And I ain't losing you too. Lieutenant Foster appeared beside them, his young face set in grim lines. Sergeant, control yourself. That's an order. Red stopped struggling, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at Joe's motionless form. 20 years of friendship, from barefoot boys fishing in Kentucky creeks to battle-hardened Marines, snuffed out in seconds. Joe's blood soaked into Peleliu's unyielding coral, steaming slightly in the merciless sun. Battalion says reinforcements are 40 minutes out. Foster continued, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. We hold position until then. 40 minutes? Dixie spat. Japs'll have our position zeroed by then. We need to move. Lieutenant, Foster's jaw tightened. Those are our orders, Corporal. Lieutenant, Eddie called, his voice strained. Enemy movement at 2 o'clock. I think they're bringing up reinforcements. Red barely heard them. A strange calm was settling over him as he watched a fly land on Joe's outstretched hand. Joe, who'd talked endlessly about the bar they would open together after the war. Joe, who'd carried Red for 2 miles when he'd caught shrapnel at Cape Gloucester. Joe, who'd promised Red's mother he'd bring her son home safe. The machine gun opened, up again, forcing them all lower behind their meager cover. A Marine from 2nd Squad screamed as bullets found him, his cries quickly silenced by another burst. We need to fall back to the secondary position, Foster shouted over the gunfire. Red felt something breaking loose inside him, something hot and savage. He thought of Joe's mother, waiting for a son who would never come home. He thought of the letters he would have to write, the personal effects he would gather. He thought of all the promises they had made each other. The rage built inside him, burning away fear, burning away reason, until there was nothing left but a killing clarity. Red checked his rifle, counted his grenades, and felt the weight of his K-bar knife against his thigh. Red? Eddie's voice seemed to come from far away. What are you doing? Red didn't answer. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. Callister! Lieutenant Foster barked, recognizing the look in his sergeant's eyes. Don't even think about it. That's an order. But Red wasn't a sergeant anymore. He wasn't a Marine or a Kentucky farm boy or even a man. He was vengeance incarnate, grief and fury melded into a weapon more dangerous than any rifle. Tell Battalion I died doing my job, Red said quietly, his voice steady despite the inferno raging inside him. Red, no. Eddie reached for him, but he was too slow. Red steadied his breathing, gripped his rifle, and prepared to charge. For Joe. For all of them. Red's world narrowed to a singular purpose as he launched himself from behind the coral outcropping. The machine gun above immediately sought him, bullets kicking up geysers of dust and rock fragments as he zigzagged across the same ground where Joe had fallen. He heard shouting behind him. Eddie's panicked voice, Dixie's thunderous curses, Lieutenant Foster's commands, but they seemed to come from another lifetime. "Callister, get back here." Foster's voice cracked with authority and fear. Red ignored him, darting from cover to cover, moving on instinct. His training took over where rage clouded his judgment. The battlefield seemed to slow around him, each decision crystallizing with deadly clarity. Dive left. Roll. Sprint to the next depression. Use the corpse of a fallen Japanese soldier for cover. Keep moving. The machine gun fire tracked him, always a half-second behind. Red could almost feel the gunner's mounting frustration as bullets meant for his flesh tore into earth instead. Sweat stung his eyes and his lungs burned, but the pain only sharpened his focus. 20 yards away, Joe's body lay crumpled and still. Red forced himself not to look. A bullet grazed his shoulder, hot and quick like a branding iron. Red barely felt it, adrenaline flooding his system. He dove behind a shattered tree, stump as another burst chewed the ground where he'd stood a moment before. Breathing hard, he unclipped a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin with his teeth, just like in the movies Joe loved, and counted. 1, 2. Red heard the machine gun pause, the gunner likely reloading or adjusting his position. 3. He hurled the grenade with all his strength, not toward the machine gun itself but to a spot just above it where the ridge provided an overhang. The grenade exploded with a sharp crack, sending chunks of coral and soil raining down. A scream confirmed at least one hit. The machine gun fell silent, but Red knew better than to believe it was over. Back at their position, Dixie watched Red's suicidal charge with mounting disbelief. "Crazy son of a bitch is gonna make it," he muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, "Cover fire. Now." Without waiting for orders, Dixie hauled his machine gun into position and opened up on the ridge, sweeping the Japanese position methodically. "Move up," he bellowed to the others. "We ain't letting him die alone." Eddie stared at him wide-eyed. "Lieutenant said, Lieutenant can court-martial my corpse?" Dixie snarled. "You coming or not, bookworm?" Eddie swallowed hard, his atoms, apple bobbing visibly. Fear was etched into every line of his scholarly face, but beneath it was something stronger, loyalty, perhaps, or simply the knowledge that abandoning Red and Dixie would be a sin he couldn't live with. He nodded once sharply and slung his radio onto his back. Lieutenant Foster watched his squad disintegrating before his eyes. Orders were clear. Hold position until reinforcements arrived. But orders hadn't accounted for Joe Ramirez dying in the dirt, or Tom Callister charging a fortified position alone. They hadn't accounted for men being men, stubborn, loyal, and unwilling to watch their brothers die. "Covering fire from 2nd Squad," Foster shouted suddenly, making his decision. He drew his sidearm and nodded at his radio man. "Tell battalion, we're advancing to neutralize the enemy position." "Sir?" The radio man looked shocked. "You heard me, and when you're done you follow us up." On the ridge, Red had reached the base of the final incline. His grenade had caused damage, but the machine gun had started up again, manned by a new gunner. The pause had been enough, though. He'd closed the distance. Using the rough coral as handholds, Red began to climb. Each movement was deliberate, testing his weight before committing. The ridge was steep but not impossible. Below he heard the welcome sound of Dixie's machine gun laying down suppressive fire. A quick glance back showed him the impossible. His squad was advancing. Dixie led the charge, his bulky frame belying his speed as he bounded between cover points, his machine gun at the ready. Eddie followed close behind, fear and determination warring on his face. And there was Lieutenant Foster, directing 2nd Squad to provide covering fire while he moved with the main assault. The sight gave Red a second wind, pushing back the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. 15 feet from the top, Red's hand closed around a seemingly stable rock that gave way beneath his weight. He slipped, scrabbling for purchases loose. Stones clattered down the ridge. The sound drew immediate fire. Bullets whined off the rocks around him, showering him with stinging fragments. Red pressed himself flat against the ridge, heart hammering. "Red." Dixie's voice carried up from below. "On your right, second outcropping." Red glanced right and saw it. A more stable route, partially hidden from the machine gun's line of fire. He took a deep breath and lunged for it, fingers finding purchase in the rough coral. The new path was steeper but more secure, and the protruding rock formation shielded him from direct fire. The sounds of battle intensified below. Second Squad had engaged enemy positions further down the line, drawing some fire away from Red's ascent. Eddie's voice rang out, surprisingly strong as he directed a fire team to their left flank. Lieutenant Foster's commands were clear and precise, adapting tactics on the fly as new threats emerged. Red reached the top of the ridge and pressed himself flat below the lip, listening. He could hear urgent Japanese voices just yards away. The machine gun fired in controlled bursts, its operator shouting what sounded like coordinates to someone else. Red pulled his last grenade, calculated angles, and waited for the next lull. When it came, he pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, and rolled the grenade over the ridge. The explosion was followed by screams and confusion. Red vaulted over the edge, rifle at the ready. The machine gun nest was a crude but effective fortification of sandbags and coral rocks with clear firing lines down the ridge. One gunner lay dead from Red's grenade, his body a mangled ruin. The second had been wounded but was still conscious, reaching for a sidearm. Red fired twice, center mass, and the man collapsed. Movement to his left. Red spun, too late. A Japanese officer emerged from a shallow tunnel entrance, sword already swinging. Red barely had time to raise his rifle to block the blow. The sword bit deep into the wooden stock lodging there. For a split second, both men stood frozen, connected by the impaled rifle. The Japanese officer snarled something, his face contorted with battle fury. He yanked the sword back, pulling the rifle from Red's grasp. Red stumbled forward off balance as the officer freed his blade for another strike. Without conscious thought, Red drew his K-bar knife and lunged inside the officer's guard, too close for an effective sword swing. The two men crashed together, grappling for leverage on the rocky ground. The Japanese officer was smaller but wiry and strong, his technique refined. Red fought with the raw desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. They rolled across the machine gun nest, sending spent cartridges scattering. The officer struck Red across the temple with the sword's hilt, sending stars exploding across his vision. Red responded by driving his knee into the man's stomach, creating enough space to slash with his knife. The blade caught the officer across the forearm, drawing a hiss of pain but no retreat. The officer kicked hard, catching Red in the chest and sending him sprawling onto his back. In an instant, the Japanese soldier was on his feet, sword raised, for a killing blow. Red saw his death in the man's cold eyes and thought absurdly of Joe's stupid jokes, of Kentucky summers, of promises that would go unkept. A single shot cracked across the ridgetop. The Japanese officer's head snapped back, a neat hole appearing between his eyes. He toppled sideways, his sword clattering uselessly beside him. Red turned to see Dixie cresting the ridge, his rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "You can thank me later," Dixie drawled, lowering his weapon. "If we live that long." Eddie appeared next, gasping for breath, his glasses hanging askew. "They're right behind me," he managed between gulps of air. Lieutenant Foster was the last over the top, directing 2 Marines from 2nd Squad to secure their flanks. "Status?" he demanded, surveying the captured position. "Machine gun neutralized," Red reported automatically, military discipline reasserting itself through the haze of combat. 2 enemy KIA, unknown number still in the tunnel system. He gestured toward the entrance the officer had emerged from. Foster nodded, his expression unreadable. There would be time later for discussions about disobeyed orders and reckless charges. For now, they had a position to secure. "Bookworm, get on that radio. Tell battalion we've taken the ridge but need immediate support. Dixie, set up your gun, facing that tunnel. 2 men on our flanks." Foster turned to Red, his voice dropping. "You good, Sergeant?" Red nodded, though Good was the furthest thing from what he felt. The rage that had carried him up the ridge was fading, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. He retrieved his rifle, grimacing at the deep cut in the stock from the officer's sword. Eddie's voice rose in alarm from the radio. "Lieutenant, battalion says large enemy force moving in from the east. ETA 3 minutes. From the tunnel entrance came the unmistakable sounds of movement, many men moving quickly. "They're coming," Red said quietly, checking his ammunition and finding it dangerously low. He thought of Joe, lying broken at the base of the ridge, and felt a strange calm settle over him. Perhaps they'd be reunited sooner than expected. The first Japanese helmet appeared at the tunnel entrance. Dixie's machine gun roared in response. The world dissolved into chaos as Japanese soldiers poured from the tunnel entrance. Dixie's machine gun cut down the first wave, bodies piling up in the narrow space, but they kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades with a determination that bordered on fanatical. "Left flank," Lieutenant Foster shouted as more enemy troops appeared along the ridge. A grenade arced through the air, landing near their position. "Grenade!" Red dove for it, scooping it up in one fluid motion and hurling it back toward the Japanese lines. The explosion sent shrapnel and dirt showering over the ridge. Someone screamed, one of their own this time. Red didn't look to see who. "There. Wasn't time. Ammo count," Foster called, firing his sidearm at 3 Japanese soldiers attempting to flank their position. "2 magazines," Red shouted back, dropping to one knee behind the captured machine gun nest. He swung the weapon around, quickly examining its mechanism. Japanese Type 92, heavy but reliable. The previous gunner had left a belt loaded. Red yanked. The charging handle and the gun roared to life in his hands, its vibration traveling up his arms and into his chest as he swept it across the advancing enemy. "Last box," Dixie answered, his voice tight with pain. Blood soaked his left sleeve, where a bullet had grazed him, but his hands remained steady on his weapon. Eddie didn't respond. The radio man had taken cover behind a rocky outcropping, frantically relaying their position to battalion. His usually pale face was flushed with exertion and spattered with blood. Not his own. A Japanese soldier appeared at the edge of their perimeter, bayonet leveled. Eddie looked up from his radio, eyes widening with terror. The soldier lunged forward just as Eddie scrambled for his sidearm. Too slow. Red swung the machine gun around, but the angle was wrong. He'd hit Eddie too. "Bookworm," he shouted in warning. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Eddie abandoned his reach for his pistol and instead grabbed his combat knife. As the Japanese soldier's bayonet thrust forward, Eddie twisted sideways. The blade missed his vital organs, but sliced a deep gash across his ribs. Eddie didn't hesitate. He drove his knife upward, under the soldier's chin and into his brain. The Japanese soldier collapsed, his body jerking with death spasms. Eddie remained frozen, his hand still clutching the knife embedded in the man's skull, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. "Eddie," Red snapped, bringing him back to reality. "Stay with us." Eddie nodded jerkily, wrenching his knife free with a sickening sound. Blood poured from his side, but his jaw was set with newfound determination. He was a different man from the scholarly radio man who had landed on Peleliu just days ago. They all were. "Battalion says reinforcements delayed," Eddie shouted, pressing, a hand to his bleeding side as he scrambled back to his radio. "Enemy movement heavy between our position and friendly lines." Lieutenant Foster ducked as rifle fire peppered their position. A bullet splintered the rock inches from his head. "How long?" 30 minutes minimum." Dixie let out a bark of bitter laughter. "We got maybe 5 before we're overrun." As if to emphasize his point, a wave of Japanese troops charged their position. From the east, at least 20 men moving in coordinated assault. Red swung the captured machine gun around, cutting a bloody swath through their ranks, but more kept coming. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm hit," one of the second squad Marines cried out, collapsing with a bullet through his thigh. Foster crawled to his side, dragging him deeper into cover. "Pressure on that wound, Marine." Red continued firing until the gun clicked empty. he abandoned, it reverting to his rifle as the enemy closed in. Every shot had to count now. Every decision could be the difference between life and death. The rage that had driven him up the ridge had burned away, replaced by cold, calculating survival instinct. He wasn't fighting for Joe anymore, or for vengeance, or even for some abstract concept of duty. He was fighting to keep breathing for 1 more minute, 1 more second. A bullet struck the coral beside Red, sending fragments slicing across his cheek. Blood trickled warm down his face, but he barely noticed. He sighted down his rifle, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. A Japanese officer fell. Red worked the bolt, aimed again. Another enemy dropped, mechanical, precise, necessary. To his right, Dixie had abandoned his larger weapon and was firing his sidearm with deadly accuracy. Blood had soaked through his entire sleeve now, dripping from his fingertips, but his face showed only grim determination. "Last mag," Dixie announced, his southern drawl stretched thin with pain. "Make it count," Red replied, firing his own last rounds. Lieutenant Foster had pulled back to Eddie's position, his uniform torn and dirty, but somehow maintaining his command presence. "Battalion, this is Echo 6, he spoke into the radio. "We are combat ineffective with critical ammunition status. Request immediate fire mission on our position." Red heard the words and understood their meaning immediately. Foster was calling artillery down on their own position. A desperate gamble. That might kill them all, but would certainly take the enemy with them. "What's the alternative?" Foster asked, catching Red's eye. "We die here for nothing, or we take as many of them with us as we can." Red nodded once, thinking of Joe's body still lying at the base of the ridge. If this was how it ended, at least, they'd go out together in a way. Eddie's voice shook as he relayed coordinates, but his hands remained steady on the radio dials. The scholarly young man who had once confessed to Red that he'd never even been in a fistfight before the war, was now calmly directing an artillery strike on his own position. The transformation would have been remarkable if it wasn't so tragic. "Fire. Mission confirmed," Eddie reported, his voice hollow. "ETA 3 minutes. That's a lifetime in combat," Dixie muttered, firing carefully at advancing shadows. "Especially when you're outgunned." A fresh wave of Japanese soldiers emerged from the tree line to their south. Red counted at least 30 before they opened fire, forcing him back into cover. A Marine from 2nd Squad screamed as bullets found him, his body jerking grotesquely before going still. "Fall back to the secondary position," Foster ordered, pointing to a cluster of rocks and sandbags 10 yards behind them. "Controlled withdrawal. Provide covering fire for each other." Red nodded to Dixie, who emptied his sidearm in a rapid succession of shots, allowing Red to scramble backward to the new position. From there, Red covered Dixie's painful retreat, the older Marine's face gray with blood loss, but still moving with determined efficiency. Eddie came next, half carrying the wounded Marine from 2nd Squad. Lieutenant Foster brought up the rear, firing his last rounds as he backpedaled toward them. Their new position was slightly elevated, with better cover, but it hardly mattered. They were down to knives and empty rifles with bayonets. The enemy knew it too. The Japanese attack intensified, emboldened by the Marines' withdrawal. "How long on that artillery?" Red asked, feeling strangely calm despite the certainty of death closing in around them. 60 seconds, Eddie replied, glancing at his watch. His uniform was dark with blood from his side wound, but his voice remained steady. "Assuming they aren't delayed." A Japanese soldier appeared suddenly at their perimeter, sword raised. Dixie met him with nothing but a combat knife, blocking the sword strike with his rifle and driving the blade deep into the man's gut. Another enemy appeared behind him, and Dixie, weaponless now, simply tackled him with a roar of defiance. Red joined the desperate struggle, fighting hand-to-hand with the surging enemy. He took a bayonet thrust to his shoulder, the sharp pain clearing his mind even further. He killed the wielder with a swift knife stroke across the throat, hot blood spraying his face and hands. There was no glory in it, no satisfaction, just the mechanical execution of survival. Eddie abandoned his radio to aid a wounded comrade, only to be confronted by a Japanese soldier leaping into their position. Without hesitation, Eddie drove, his knife into the man's chest, his scholarly face transformed by desperate violence. As the enemy soldier collapsed, Eddie stared at his bloodied hands with a mixture of horror and resignation. "I never," he began, then shook his head. "I never thought I could." "Later," Red cut him off, knowing how dangerous reflection could be in the middle of combat. "Stay alive now. Think later." Lieutenant Foster had taken up Dixie's discarded rifle, using it as a club against the advancing enemy. His officer's cap was gone. His face streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes remained clear and focused. He fought with the precision of a man who had accepted his fate, but refused to surrender to it. As the Japanese closed in from all sides, a distant rumble shook the ridge. "Artillery, coming in hot. Take cover," Foster shouted, diving behind the largest boulder in their position. Red saw Dixie still struggling with an enemy soldier at the edge of their perimeter, too far from cover. Without thinking, he launched himself toward his friend, tackling both Dixie and his opponent. They tumbled together into a shallow depression. As the first shell hit 50 yards down the ridge, the world exploded in sound and fury. The ground beneath them bucked like a living thing. Dirt, rock, and dismembered bodies hurled through the air as shell after shell pounded the ridge. Red pressed himself flat, covering Dixie's larger frame as best he could, while the Japanese soldier who had been fighting them moments before was torn apart by shrapnel. "Some days," Dixie shouted over the deafening barrage, his voice strained, but still carrying that hint of gallows humor. "I really hate this job." Red couldn't muster a response. Each impact sent shock waves through the ground, rattling his teeth and bones. The air filled with dust and cordite, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Somewhere nearby, Eddie was calling out for Lieutenant Foster, his voice barely audible through the chaos. A shell hit closer, too close. Red felt the concussion lift him bodily from the ground before slamming him back down. Pain exploded across his back as shrapnel tore through his uniform. Beside him, Dixie grunted in agony as fragments found him too. The world narrowed to a pinpoint of pain and noise. Red could no longer tell if the high-pitched ringing was artillery or just his shattered eardrums. He tasted blood in his mouth and couldn't tell if it was his own. The sky above, briefly visible through swirling dust, seemed impossibly blue and distant. Red's last coherent thought before darkness took him was of Joe. Not Joe's broken body at the base of the ridge, but Joe alive, laughing as they swam in a Kentucky creek one golden summer afternoon, forever young, forever untouched by war. The artillery continued to fall as consciousness slipped away from him, the earth shaking with impact after impact, burying friend and foe alike beneath Peleliu's unforgiving coral. Red awoke to silence, not the peaceful silence of dawn or dusk, but the hollow, ringing absence that follows extreme violence, the quiet of a graveyard. His eyes opened to a sky choked with dust and smoke, the sun a dim orange sphere struggling to penetrate the haze. For a moment he wondered if he was dead. Pain answered that question. It radiated from everywhere at once. His back, where shrapnel had torn into him. His shoulder, where the bayonet had struck, countless bruises and lacerations from being tossed by the artillery blast. Red catalogued each injury with detached precision, a habit formed over years of combat. Nothing immediately fatal. Nothing that would take him out of the fight. Except there was no fight left. Just stillness. The air smelled of cordite, burnt flesh, and the strange metallic tang that lingered after artillery bombardment. Red's ears still rang, making the silence feel even more profound. He tried to recall the final moments before darkness had claimed him. The deafening roar of shells, the ground bucking beneath him like a wild horse, Dixie's pained grunt as shrapnel found him. Now there was only the aftermath, the terrible stillness that always follows the thunder of battle. "Dixie?" Red's voice emerged as a rasp, his throat raw from screaming orders he couldn't remember giving. He turned his head slowly, wincing at the stabbing pain in his neck, and saw the corporal lying beside him in their shallow depression. Dixie's eyes were closed, his weathered face slack. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark and viscous. For one terrible moment, Red thought he was gone. Then Dixie's chest rose slightly, a barely perceptible movement. "I ain't dead yet," Dixie muttered without opening his eyes. "Though I'm starting to think that might have been the easier option." Relief washed through Red, surprising him with its intensity. "How bad?" "Bad enough." Dixie's eyes finally opened, squinting against the dust-filled light. "Caught some metal. In my back and leg." "You? I'll live." Red pushed himself up on his elbows, surveying what remained of the battlefield. The ridge was unrecognizable. Craters pockmarked the ground where artillery had struck, some large enough to swallow a jeep. Bodies lay strewn across the blasted landscape, many torn apart by the shelling. The machine gun nest had been obliterated, replaced by a smoking hole in the ground. Here and there, the coral limestone had been fused to glass by the heat of the explosions. "Jesus," Dixie whispered beside him, taking in the devastation. Movement caught Red's eye. A figure picking its way through the wreckage about 30 yards away. He tensed, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there, before recognizing Eddie's lanky form. The radio man moved methodically from body to body, checking for signs of life, his movements robotic and his face expressionless. Red called out to him, his voice stronger now. "Bookworm!" Eddie's head snapped up, his eyes finding Red through the haze. For a moment he didn't react. Then something like relief flickered across his face and he changed direction, moving toward them with careful steps. "You're alive," Eddie said when he reached them, his voice flat and oddly formal. Blood had dried in streaks across his face and his glasses were gone, making him look younger and more vulnerable. "Lieutenant Foster is checking the perimeter with Johnson from 2nd Squad. They're the only others still." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the carnage around them. "Japanese?" Red asked, pushing himself to a sitting position despite the pain that lanced through his back. "Most died in the barrage. The few that survived." Eddie's voice faltered. He swallowed hard before continuing. "They took their own lives rather than surrender." Red nodded. He'd seen it before. The Japanese fought with a fanaticism that went beyond duty or patriotism, a willingness to die that made them both formidable and tragic opponents. "Help me with Dixie," Red said, forcing strength into his voice. "He's hit bad." Together, they managed to get Dixie into a more sheltered position behind an overturned ammunition crate that had somehow survived the shelling. Eddie produced a canteen and a first aid kit from somewhere, his movements efficient but strangely disconnected, as if he were watching himself perform these actions from a distance. "You did good, Bookworm," Red said quietly, watching Eddie clean Dixie's wounds with mechanical precision. Eddie's hands stilled for a moment. "Did I?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I killed 3 men today with a knife with my hands." He looked down at those hands now stained with Dixie's blood as he tried to help. "I never thought I could do that." "War changes you," Dixie grunted, wincing as Eddie resumed his ministrations. "Ain't no shame in surviving. Isn't there?" Eddie's face contorted briefly before settling back into that unsettling blankness. "The man I was before Peleliu, before today, he wouldn't recognize me now." "That man wouldn't have survived," Red said simply. Eddie nodded, but Red could see his words provided little comfort. The transformation from scholar to killer wasn't one that could be easily reconciled, especially not in the immediate aftermath of battle. That reckoning would come later, in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come. "Sergeant Callister." Lieutenant Foster's voice came from behind them, authoritative despite the exhaustion evident in every syllable. "Good to see you alive." Red turned to see Foster picking his way toward them, followed by a haggard-looking Marine from 2nd Squad. Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Iowa who now moved with the wariness of a battle-hardened veteran. Foster's uniform was in tatters and a makeshift bandage wrapped his forearm, but he carried himself with the same composure he'd shown since landing on Peleliu. "Lieutenant," Red acknowledged, attempting to stand before Foster waved him back. "Down, save your strength. Reinforcements are 20 minutes out." Foster surveyed their small group, taking stock of injuries and mental states with a practiced eye. "We held the position. Battalion says the Japanese are falling back across this whole sector." The words should have felt like victory. Instead, They landed with the weight of a funeral announcement. They had held the position, yes, but at what cost? Red looked around at the blasted landscape, the broken bodies, the hollow-eyed survivors. Was this ridge worth the price they had paid? Once the reinforcements arrive, we'll evacuate the wounded, Foster continued. The rest of us will push forward with Baker Company to secure the next ridge. The war marched on, relentless and indifferent to individual suffering. Tomorrow there would be another ridge, another machine gun nest, another desperate fight. Red had known this intellectually, but now he felt it in his bones, the grinding futility of it all. I need to find Joe, Red said abruptly, pushing himself to his feet despite the pain that lanced through his body. Foster hesitated, then nodded once. Johnson will go with you. I need to do this alone, Red said, his voice leaving no room for argument. After a moment, Foster conceded with a slight inclination of his head. Be back before reinforcements arrive. Red made his way carefully down the shattered ridge, his boots slipping on loose rocks and debris. The artillery had transformed the landscape, making it difficult to get his bearings. Twice he stopped, disoriented, before identifying landmarks that had survived the barrage, a distinctive coral formation, the twisted remains of a tree. When he finally reached the spot where Joe had fallen, Red's breath caught in his throat. The body was still there, untouched by the artillery that had devastated everything around it, as if death itself had placed a protective hand over Joe Ramirez. Red knelt beside his friend, ignoring the pain that shot through his injured leg. Joe's face was peaceful in death, the fear and confusion of his final moments erased. If not for the dark stains that spread across his uniform, he might have been sleeping. I got him, Joe, Red said softly, his voice cracking. I got the bastards who did this to you. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. What did vengeance matter now? It wouldn't bring Joe back. It wouldn't erase the image of him reaching out as life slipped away. It wouldn't change the fact that Red would have to write to Joe's mother, explaining how her son had died on a forgotten coral ridge on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. Memories flooded through Red's mind. Joe teaching him to dance before they shipped out, insisting he'd need the skill when they returned home heroes. Joe's laughter as they'd huddled in a foxhole during a tropical downpour, somehow finding humor even as they shivered in mud up to their knees. The way Joe had carried a worn photograph of his family, showing it to anyone who would listen, describing the tamales his mother would make when he returned home. Remember that promise we made in Melbourne? Red whispered, his throat tight. That bar we were going to open. The lucky ones, you called it. He let out a shaky breath. Guess only one of us got lucky today, and it wasn't you. A fly landed on Joe's cheek. Red gently brushed it away, the simple gesture nearly breaking him. The finality of death, its stillness, its indifference, struck him with fresh force. This wasn't the first friend he'd lost, but Joe had been different. Joe had been the brother he'd never had, the constant that had made the war bearable. Red reached out with trembling fingers and closed Joe's eyes. Then he gently removed the St. Christopher medal from around Joe's neck, the one Joe's mother had given him before they shipped out. I'll get this back to her, Red promised. Along with your letters. He sat there for a long moment, the medal clutched in his fist as the reality of Joe's death washed over him in waves. The fury that had carried him up the ridge was gone, leaving behind a vast emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. In its place came something worse. Doubt. Had his reckless charge been an act of heroism or selfish revenge? Had he led his men into unnecessary danger because he couldn't bear his own grief? I don't know if I did the right thing, Red admitted to Joe's unhearing ears. I don't know if any of this is right anymore. From the top of the ridge came shouts, reinforcements, arriving at last. Soon they would come looking for him. Soon the business of war would resume with all its grinding momentum. But for now, in this small pocket of quiet, Red allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Carefully, reverently, he lifted Joe's body into his arms. His wounds screamed in protest, but Red ignored them. He would not leave his friend on this God-forsaken ridge. He would carry him back just as Joe had once carried him through the jungles of Cape Gloucester. The climb back up was agony. Each step sent fresh waves of pain through Red's battered body, and Joe's weight seemed to increase with every yard. Sweat poured down Red's face, mingling with tears he didn't bother to hide. By the time he crested the ridge, his legs were shaking, and his vision had narrowed to a dim tunnel. The first person he saw was Eddie, who rushed forward to help but stopped short at the look on Red's face. Behind him, a line of fresh Marines stared in solemn silence as Red carried Joe's body across the blasted ground. Lieutenant Foster approached slowly, his expression grave. "I'll arrange for him to be evacuated with the wounded," he said quietly. Red nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Gently, he laid Joe's body on a stretcher that someone had brought forward. For a moment he kept his hand on Joe's chest, unwilling to break this final contact. Through the torn fabric of Joe's uniform, Red could feel the cooling skin beneath, the absence of the heartbeat that had been as familiar to him as his own in the close quarters of foxholes and barracks. "Goodbye, brother," he whispered, so quietly that none could hear. "Sergeant," Foster's voice was gentle but firm, "we need you," the war called, insistent and unyielding. Red straightened, tucking Joe's medal into his pocket. He turned to face the newcomers, fresh-faced Marines who had yet to see real combat, who still believed in glory and heroism and purpose. They looked at him with something like awe, no doubt having heard already about the sergeant who had charged a machine gun nest alone. One young Marine, barely old enough to shave, stepped forward slightly. "Sergeant Callister?" he asked, his voice tinged with reverence. "They're saying you took that nest single-handed, sir." Red studied the boy's face. The eager eyes, the unlined forehead, the mouth not yet taught to hide emotion behind a mask of indifference. He saw in him the man Joe had been back at Camp Pendleton, before artillery and machine guns and death had rewritten them all. For a moment Red couldn't speak, caught between the impulse to warn the boy about what was coming and the knowledge that no warning would be enough. If only they knew the truth, that his charge had been born of grief and rage, not courage, that victory had come at a price none of them were prepared to pay, that the hero they thought they saw was just a broken man trying to hold himself together long enough to make it through one more day of war. Dixie had been loaded onto a stretcher, his face gray with pain but his eyes alert. As they prepared to carry him down to the aid station, he caught Red's gaze. "Was it worth it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Red looked around at the devastated ridge, now secured at terrible cost. Worth it? How could anyone measure such a thing? The strategic value of one coral outcropping against the lives of good men? "I don't know," he answered honestly. Dixie nodded, as if this was the answer he had expected. "You did what you had to do. That's all any of us can do in this mess." As the stretcher-bearers carried Dixie away, Red watched the reinforcements setting up defensive positions, fresh-faced kids who would be old men by nightfall if they survived at all. Eddie stood apart, staring at his bloodied hands as if seeing them for the first time. Lieutenant Foster was already conferring with the commanding officer of the reinforcements, pointing toward the next ridge where new battles waited. The war machine grinding onward, heedless of individual suffering. Red touched the St. Christopher medal in his pocket, feeling its contours press against his palm. Something had broken inside him today. Not just his belief in purpose or meaning, but something more fundamental. The person he had been before climbing this ridge no longer existed. As the sun began to set over Peleliu, casting long shadows across the blasted landscape, Red watched the corpsman load Joe's body onto a truck, bound for the beach. The war wasn't over, but something inside him was. In the distance, Navy ships still pounded Japanese positions with their big guns, each impact sending tremors through the coral beneath Red's feet. New orders were already being distributed, fresh objectives marked, on maps. Marines around him cleaned weapons, counted ammunition, wrote quick letters home, the rituals of men who understood that tomorrow would bring more of the same. Red touched Joe's medal again, feeling its imprint against his palm. He'd carry it now along with the weight of everything that had happened on this ridge. He'd carry it through whatever battles remained, across whatever islands still stood between them and home. He'd carry it back to a small house in Los Angeles, where a mother waited for a son who would never return. Eddie approached, his expression still distant but his steps steadier now. "They're setting up a forward aid station just below the ridge," he said. "Corpsman says you should get those wounds looked at." Red nodded, but made no move to go. "You all right, Bookworm?" Eddie considered the question with scholarly seriousness. "No," he finally answered. "I don't think any of us are, but we keep going anyway, don't we?" The simplicity of the observation struck Red with unexpected force. That was the truth of it. They weren't all right, would perhaps never be all right again, but they would keep going because the alternative was unthinkable. "Yeah," Red agreed softly. "We keep going." The last light of day caught the edge of Peleliu's highest ridge, turning the battle-scarred coral to gold for one brief moment before darkness claimed it. Tomorrow would bring new orders, new objectives, new deaths. But tonight, in the quiet after the thunder, Red allowed himself to grieve for Joe, for himself, and for all the men they had been before climbing this blood-soaked hill. 3 days after the artillery strike, what remained of Red's squad was pulled back from the front lines. The respite wasn't a reward, but a necessity. They'd been reduced to 4 men, and even those 4 were held together by bandages, sulfa powder, and stubborn determination. Battalion had established a temporary rest area a quarter-mile from the beach, where the constant rhythm of waves provided a surreal counterpoint to the distant thunder of naval guns still pounding Japanese positions further inland. Red sat alone, on a crate of K-rations, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. The weapon didn't need it. He'd already stripped, oiled, and reassembled it twice. But the familiar ritual gave his hands something to do while his mind wandered dangerous paths. His wounds had been dressed at the aid station, 27 pieces of shrapnel removed from his back and legs, a neat row of stitches closing the bayonet gash in his shoulder. The corpsman had offered morphine for the pain, but Red refused. Pain kept things clear, kept the ghosts at bay, at least while the sun was up. Nightfall was different. In the darkness, Red saw Joe's face every time he closed his eyes. Not the peaceful visage of death, but Joe alive, laughing, full of plans for their future. In his dreams, they were back in Kentucky, fishing the same creek they'd known as boys. The war nothing but a distant shadow. Then Joe would turn to him, bullet holes suddenly appearing in his chest, his mouth moving with words Red couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Why didn't you stop me? Why didn't you save me?" Red would wake, gasping, drenched in sweat, his wounds throbbing in time with his racing heart. "Sergeant Callister?" Red looked up to see Lieutenant Foster approaching, accompanied by a major he didn't recognize. Red started to rise, but Foster waved him back down. "At ease, Sergeant. Major Williamson wanted to meet you personally." The major was a square-jawed man with eyes that had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much combat. "Quite an action you led up there, Sergeant," he said without preamble. Lieutenant Foster's report was impressive. Red felt a flicker of surprise. Whatever Foster had written in his report, it couldn't have been the unvarnished truth, that Red had disobeyed direct orders, endangered his entire squad, and acted out of blind rage rather than tactical consideration. The men did their job. "Sir," Red replied, his voice carefully neutral. "They did more than that." The major produced a small box from his pocket. "This is preliminary, of course. There'll be paperwork, a proper ceremony back at division." He opened the box to reveal a silver star nestled on velvet. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action." Red stared at the medal, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. Gallantry. As if there had been anything gallant about what happened on that ridge, as if medals could balance the scales against the cost they'd paid. "Thank you, sir," he said mechanically, "but I was just doing my job." The major studied him for a moment, perhaps recognizing the hollowness behind the words. "Your actions broke a Japanese strongpoint that had stalled our advance for 2 days. Because of what you and your men did, we've pushed their line back nearly half a mile." He closed the box and handed it to Red. The why doesn't change the what, Sergeant. After the officers left, Red sat holding the small box, making no move to open it again. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained not just metal and ribbon, but the ghosts of all the men who had died on that ridge. Heard you're getting the Silver Star. Red looked up to see Eddie approaching, walking with the slight limp that came from the bayonet wound in his side. The radio man had changed since the battle. He moved differently. Gone was the scholarly awkwardness, replaced by a purposeful economy of movement. His eyes, once wide and expressive behind his glasses, had taken on the guarded look of a man who had seen too much. News travels fast, Red said, tucking the box into his pocket. Eddie lowered himself carefully onto a crate opposite Red. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared out at the beach where landing craft continued to shuttle supplies and reinforcements ashore. Was it worth it? Eddie finally asked, his voice quiet but intent. All of it, Joe. The others. This? He gestured at his own bandaged side. The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Red considered deflecting it with platitudes about duty and sacrifice, the kind that officers like Major Williamson trafficked in. But he owed Eddie more than that. I don't know, he admitted. When I went up that ridge, I wasn't thinking about breaking their line or advancing our position. I was thinking about Joe. Revenge then, maybe at first. Red set aside his rifle, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. But it changed. By the end, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was just about surviving, about making sure you all survived. Eddie nodded slowly. I've been trying to reconcile it. What I did up there with who I thought I was. Before the war, I couldn't even dissect a frog in biology class without getting sick. Now. He trailed off, flexing his hands as if still feeling the resistance of flesh against his knife. You did what you had to do, Red said. That's what scares me, Eddie replied, his voice dropping lower. How easily what I had to do became killing another human being. What happens after all this? Do we just go back to our lives like none of it happened? Do I pick up my books again and pretend I don't know what it feels like to watch the light go out in someone's eyes? Red thought of his own life before. The small farm outside Lexington, his mother's vegetable garden, the job at the lumber mill that had been waiting for him. It all seemed to belong to another person now, a stranger who had never held a dying friend or felt the recoil of an M1 against his shoulder as he took another man's life. I used to have this dream, Red said, surprising himself with the admission. Before Peleliu, even before Gloucester, I'd dream about walking up the road to my ma's house, seeing her on the porch like she was when I left. Everything just as it was. He picked up a handful of coral pebbles, letting them filter through his fingers. Don't have that dream anymore. What, changed? I did. Red looked up at the younger man. And so did you, bookworm. Maybe we don't go back. Maybe we just go forward carrying this with us. The question struck at something Red had been avoiding confronting, the after. If they survived, if they made it home, what then? How did a man carry these experiences back to the world of corner drugstores and Sunday baseball games? I don't have answers for you, bookworm, Red said honestly. I'm still working through the same questions myself. Eddie's mouth twisted in a smile that held no humor. The scholar in me always believed every question had an answer. Now I'm not so sure. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. The sound of someone clearing their throat broke the moment. Red looked up to see a Navy chaplain standing nearby, his collar pristine despite the dust that covered everything else on Peleliu. Sergeant Callister? The chaplain asked. I understand you made a request about your friend, Corporal Ramirez? Red nodded, rising to his feet. Yes, sir. It's been arranged. This evening at 1800. Red thanked him, and the chaplain moved on to where other Marines gathered in small, subdued groups around the rest area. What was that about? Eddie asked. Joe, Red answered simply. I asked if I could bury him myself. The cemetery had been established in a clearing about 100 yards inland from the beach, far enough to avoid the constant traffic of men and machinery, but close enough to protect those who came to pay their respects. White crosses stretched in neat rows, too many for an island most Americans hadn't heard of before the war. Each grave had been dug by Seabees, the Navy's construction battalion, their efficiency extending even to this most solemn of tasks. But Joe's grave, Red had insisted on digging himself. The chaplain had tried to dissuade him, pointing out his injuries, offering to have others do the work. Red had been adamant. Some debts could only be paid in sweat and pain. The coral-rich soil of Peleliu fought him every inch of the way. It tore at his hands, aggravated his wounds, and seemed to resist his efforts to create this final resting place for his friend. By the time the grave was deep enough, Red's bandages had soaked through with fresh blood, and his uniform clung to him, drenched with sweat. As he dug, memories surfaced with each thrust of the shovel. The recruitment office in Lexington, where he and Joe had enlisted together the day after Pearl Harbor. Joe's easy confidence making even war seem like an adventure waiting to happen. Boot camp at Paris Island, where Joe's quick wit had gotten them through the grueling training, softening even the hardest drill instructor with his uncanny ability to make others laugh. Their first liberty in San Diego, Joe dragging a reluctant Red to a dance hall where they'd met a pair of sisters. What were their names? Donna and Margaret? Mary? The details blurred, but he remembered Joe's infectious grin as he twirled his girl across the floor. Red paused, leaning on the shovel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The physical exertion was almost welcome. It gave dimension to the pain inside him, made it tangible and therefore manageable. Each drop of sweat felt like penance, each throb of his wounds a reminder of what Joe had suffered in those final moments. Thought I might find you here. Red turned to see Dixie making his way toward the gravesite, his progress slow, but determined on his crutches. The older Marine's face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear and evaluating as they took in the scene. Should you be up? Red asked, knowing the question was futile. Dixie was as stubborn as they came. Probably not. Dixie maneuvered himself to the edge of the grave, looking down at Red's work. Don't reckon you should be doing this either, but here we are. Red resumed digging, grateful that Dixie didn't offer platitudes or try to take over. The older man simply stood there, a silent witness to Red's labor. When Red finally climbed out of the completed grave, his legs nearly buckling from exhaustion, Dixie handed him a canteen without comment. The chaplain arrived last, carrying his Bible and wearing the somber expression of a man who had performed too many such services in too short a time. Joe's body, wrapped in a poncho, was brought on a stretcher carried by two corpsmen. Red climbed out of the grave, standing at its edge as they lowered Joe into the earth. The chaplain began to speak, his words familiar and rehearsed, yet somehow still carrying weight. Words about sacrifice and duty, about eternal rest and God's mercy. Red heard them as if from a great distance, focusing instead on the shape beneath the poncho, trying to reconcile it with the vibrant friend he had known. When the chaplain finished, he looked to Red expectantly. Would you like to say a few words, Sergeant? Red stepped forward, suddenly aware of the eyes upon him. He had never been one for public speaking, had always left the speeches to Joe, who could charm anyone with his easy smile and quick wit. But now Joe was silent, and Red had to find words enough for both of them. Joe Ramirez was the best man I ever knew, he began, his voice low but carrying in the hushed cemetery. He was my friend, my brother. Red paused, searching for words that could capture the essence of the man lying in the grave. He used to talk about after the war, after all this. He had plans, a bar we'd open together, girls we'd meet, life we'd live. Red's voice threatened to break, but he pushed through. Joe believed in things, in people, in the future. Even here, even in this hellhole, he never stopped believing that something better waited for us all. Red reached into his pocket and withdrew Joe's St. Christopher medal. He studied it for a moment before continuing. We met when we were 8 years old, Red continued, memories flooding back. I was the new kid in school, skinny and scared, and some older boys decided to welcome me with their fists. Joe stepped in, half their size but twice as fierce. Got his nose broken for his trouble. A ghost of a smile crossed Red's face. When I asked him why he'd done it, he just shrugged and said, "Looked like you needed a friend." That was Joe. Always seeing the best in people, always ready to help, even at his own expense. Red looked around at the gathered Marines, seeing recognition in their faces. Each of them had their own Joe stories, moments of kindness, of humor, of unexpected grace in the midst of war's brutality. A few nights before we shipped out for Peleliu, Joe and I got drunk in a little bar in Pavuvu. He started talking about death. First time I'd ever heard him mention it. Said if he didn't make it, he didn't want anybody weeping over him. Said he wanted to be remembered for his life, not his death. Red's fingers tightened around the metal. So that's what I'm asking of all of you today. Remember Joe Ramirez for how he lived, not how he died. Remember his laugh, his stupid jokes, the way he could find something to smile about even in the worst conditions. Remember that he believed in a future worth fighting for. I don't know if I still believe in any of that, but I believed in Joe. And if there's any justice in this world or the next, he's at peace now. Red knelt beside the grave and gently placed the medal atop the poncho-wrapped body. "I promised I'd get this back to your mother," he said softly, "but I think she'd want you to keep it. Watch over you wherever you're going." He stood and stepped back, nodding to the chaplain that he was finished. As the first shovelful of coral dirt hit the poncho with a sound that struck Red as unbearably final, Dixie hobbled to his side. "You did right by him," Dixie said, his gruff, voice gentler than Red had ever heard it. "Both up on that ridge and here." "Did I?" Red wasn't sure he believed it. "I got him killed, Dixie. If I'd been faster, if I'd stopped him." "Horse shit," Dixie interrupted. "Joe made his own choices. We all do out here." He shifted his weight on the crutches, wincing slightly. "Feeling guilty won't bring him back. Won't bring any of them back." "Then what's the point?" Red asked, the question escaping before he could hold it back. "Of any of it?" Dixie considered this for a long moment, watching as Marines took turns adding dirt to Joe's grave. "The point is we keep going," he finally said. "We fight for each other. We remember those who don't make it, and maybe if we're lucky, we find a way to live with what we've done when it's all over." It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was the most honest assessment Red had heard since landing on Peleliu. The burial detail finished their work, patting down the mound of fresh earth and placing a temporary marker at the head of the grave. The small gathering began to disperse, Marines moving off in twos and threes, returning to the war that continued to rage across the island. Lieutenant Foster was the last to leave, pausing beside Red. "We move back to the front tomorrow morning," he said. "I need to know if you're up for it, Sergeant." The question carried layers of meaning beyond the simple assessment of Red's physical condition. Foster was asking if Red could lead men again, if he could make the hard decisions, if the recklessness that had driven him up the ridge had burned itself out. "I'll be ready, sir," Red answered, meeting Foster's gaze steadily. Foster nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Get some rest then. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He started to walk away, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I would have done the same thing for any of my men, including you." After everyone had gone, Red remained alone by the grave. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. In the distance, naval gunfire continued, its deadly percussion a reminder that the battle for Peleliu was far from over. Red knelt beside the fresh earth, removing his helmet. Despite his promise to Foster, he wasn't sure if he was ready to return to the fight. The rage that had carried him up the ridge was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep into every corner of his being. But there were still men who depended on him. Eddie, finding his way through the darkness of what he'd become. Dixie, fighting through pain with stubborn courage. The replacements who would join them tomorrow, young and scared and needing guidance. "I don't know if I can do this without you, Joe," Red whispered to the grave. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." He remembered the last letter he'd received from his mother, just days before the landing on Peleliu. She'd written about the change, of seasons back home, how the maples along their property line were turning that bright Kentucky red that had given Tom his nickname as a child. She'd ended with a question. When do you think you and Joe might come home? As if their return was a certainty, as if war was just a temporary interruption to a life that waited patiently for their return. What would he write to her now? How? Could he explain what had happened on that ridge? The words seemed inadequate, hollow in the face of such loss. And what of Joe's mother? The thought of writing to Mrs. Ramirez filled Red with a different kind of dread. What could he possibly say to a woman who had entrusted her son to his care? Red traced his fingers through the loose soil of the grave, feeling its texture, so different from the rich Kentucky earth he'd known all his life. Strange to think that Joe would rest here forever, so far from home, in soil that had never known his laughter or felt his footsteps before these past bloody days. You always said I thought too much. Red continued his one-sided conversation with Joe. Said I needed to live more in the moment like you. He picked up a small piece of coral, turning it over in his palm. Guess I'll have to try. For both of us now. No answer came from the earth, only the soft whisper of the evening breeze through palm fronds and the distant rumble of war. Red remained kneeling, letting the quiet seep into him, finding in it not peace exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin, acceptance. Acceptance that Joe was gone. Acceptance that the war would continue its grinding progress with or without his participation. Acceptance that he had been changed in ways that could never be undone. As twilight deepened, Red reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook, Joe's journal, recovered from his pack after the battle. He had been carrying it with him since Joe's death, unable to bring himself to read it, yet unwilling to let it out of his possession. Now, sitting beside the grave, it felt right to finally open it. The pages were filled with Joe's familiar handwriting, a mix of Spanish and English, prayers and jokes interspersed with observations about their daily life. Red flipped through it carefully, handling the worn pages as if they might crumble under his touch. Near the end, he found an entry dated just 2 days before the landing on Peleliu. Tom's been quiet lately. Too much in his head, as usual. Worried. About the landing, I guess. We all are, though nobody says it. Strange to think that after all we've been through, there's still more ahead. But if anyone can get us through it, it's Red. Never met anyone so stubbornly determined to keep his people alive. Even me, who's always been more trouble than I'm worth. Red paused, surprised by the words. Joe, who had always seemed so confident, so certain of their survival, had harbored his own fears. And somehow, despite those fears, he had trusted Red to see them through. If anything happens to me, I hope he doesn't blame himself. That's what he does. Carries everyone's weight like it all depends on him alone. I've tried to tell him that's not how it works, but he never listens. Stubborn Kentucky mule. But that's why we follow him. Because he cares enough to carry us, even when he shouldn't have to. Red closed the journal, pressing it against his chest for a moment before returning it to his pocket. Joe had seen him, truly seen him, with all his flaws and strengths, and had followed him anyway, had trusted him, had believed in him. I'm still that stubborn mule, Joe, Red said softly to the grave. Still trying to carry it all, but I hear you now. I'm listening. Eventually, Red rose, brushing dirt from his uniform in a futile gesture toward military propriety. His hands were shaking, he noticed with detached curiosity. Not the violent tremors of fear or shock, but the subtle quiver of a man reaching his limits. He clenched them into fists, willing the trembling to stop, but it persisted. A physical manifestation of wounds that went far deeper than shrapnel or bayonets. The first stars were appearing overhead, bright pinpoints in a sky untouched by the war that raged below. Red remembered nights in Kentucky when he and Joe had laid on their backs in a field, naming constellations and making up stories about them. Joe had always been better at that, spinning tales out of starlight, finding patterns where Red saw only chaos. He wondered if the stars looked the same from Los Angeles, where Joe's family would be receiving the telegram soon, if they hadn't already. Government issue condolences. Joe's life reduced to a few formal sentences and a flag folded. With military precision. Sergeant Callister? Red turned to see a young Marine standing at a respectful distance, his silhouette barely visible in the growing darkness. One of the replacements who had arrived that afternoon, fresh-faced and newly assigned to what remained of Red's squad. "Sorry to interrupt, sir," the young Marine continued, his voice betraying his youth. "Lieutenant Foster asked me to find you, said there's a briefing at 2,000 hours for tomorrow's operation." Of course there was. The war machinery grinding on, feeding young men like this one into its insatiable maw. Red studied him. Couldn't have been more than 18. His uniform, still creased from supply, his face unlined by fear or loss or grief. For a moment, Red saw Joe as he had been that first day at Paris Island, before the South Pacific had written its harsh lessons on his body and soul. "What's your name, Private?" Red asked. "Miller, sir. Daniel Miller." "Where you from, Miller?" "Ohio, sir. Little town called Marietta on the river." Red nodded, replacing his helmet. "First combat deployment?" "Yes, sir." Miller hesitated, then added, "Some of the men, they told me about what you did on the ridge. Said you're the reason any of them made it out alive." The words hit Red like physical blows. Is that what they were saying? That his reckless, grief-driven charge had been some kind of heroism? The thought turned his stomach. "Don't believe everything you hear, Miller," Red said, more sharply than he'd intended. Seeing the young Marine's face fall, he softened his tone. "War's more complicated than the stories people tell about it. Remember that." "Yes, sir." Miller shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain how to navigate this conversation with his new sergeant. Red sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of his responsibility toward this boy and all the others who would look to him in the coming days. "Let's get to that briefing. And Miller?" "Sir? Stay close to me tomorrow. Do exactly as I say when I say it." "Yes, sir." As they walked away from the cemetery, Red resisted the urge to look back at Joe's grave. There would be time enough for goodbyes after the war if he survived. For now there were men who needed him, the living, not the dead. He would carry Joe with him, along with all the others he had lost, their weight both burden and ballast, as he navigated the treacherous waters ahead. The camp came into view, a collection of tents and supply dumps illuminated by carefully shielded lights. Marines moved about with purpose, preparing for tomorrow's push. Red straightened his shoulders, ignoring the pain that lanced through his back at the movement. Around his neck he wore Joe's St. Christopher medal, its weight a constant reminder of what had been lost and what remained at stake. "Hey, Sarge," Eddie called, waving from outside the command tent. "Thought we'd lost you." "No," Red answered, finding a small measure of strength in the certainty of his words. "You haven't lost me." As full darkness settled over Peleliu, Sergeant Tom "Red" Callister walked toward his waiting men, carrying his burdens with a new resolve. The shadow of a lone palm tree stretched across the camp, like a sentinel keeping watch over them all. Behind him, the temporary marker on Joe's grave stood among many others, a solitary white cross in a field that grew more crowded with each passing day. The battle for the ridge was over. The war raged on, and Red walked the narrow path between them, forever changed by what he had lost and what he had found in the brutal crucible of Peleliu's unforgiving terrain. But he walked forward, for Joe, for his men, for whatever future waited beyond the horizon of war. He walked forward because that was all any of them could do, step by painful step carrying their dead with them, toward a tomorrow none of them could clearly see but had to believe in nonetheless. It wasn't enough. It would have to be enough. Up. Next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.